The United States has fired more than 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles into Iran in 30 days. Each one costs up to $3.6 million, and America produces roughly 90 to 100 of them per year. Do the math. The Pentagon just burned through somewhere between 5 and 8 years of Tomahawk production in a single month. 13 American service members are dead. More than 300 are wounded. The most expensive warship ever built has been pulled from the fight, and Iran is still standing, still launching, still bleeding the U.S. dry every single day. Before a single shot is analyzed, the numbers alone tell you something is deeply wrong. 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles in 30 days. At $3.6 million each, that's roughly $3 billion in cruise missiles alone. For a weapon system, America manufactures fewer than 100 of per year. No country on Earth can sustain that burn rate. The supply chain simply doesn't exist to replenish it quickly, and the Tomahawks are just the beginning. 13 service members killed in action, more than 300 wounded. The USS Gerald R. a warship that cost the American taxpayer $13.3 billion to build, has been withdrawn from frontline operations after a non-combat fire broke out on board during active deployment. The ship that was supposed to project American power across the Persian Gulf is sitting in a repair facility while Iran keeps firing. The first 6 days of the war cost $11.3 billion. According to a closed-door Pentagon briefing to Congress, the total bill has now passed $18 billion, and Donald Trump has gone to Congress requesting an additional $200 billion to keep the campaign running. That's not a war budget. That's a national emergency. The question that nobody in Washington seems to want to answer is simple. What are you getting for that money? Because 30 days in, the honest answer is not much. 4 decades in the making. To understand why this war has gone the way it has, you have to go back to 1988. That year, the Iran-Iraq War ended after 8 brutal years that killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. Iran came out of that war economically shattered, militarily exhausted, and having learned one lesson that would define everything that followed. You do not fight the West in a straight line. The American military, even in the 1980s, was a technological force that Iran had no realistic chance of defeating in conventional combat. So Iran made a decision that most Western strategists dismissed or underestimated for 30 years. Instead of building a bigger army, they built a network. Instead of massing forces in one place, they distributed leverage across the entire region in places that were difficult to target, difficult to hold, and expensive to fight. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the popular mobilization forces in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, militia networks woven into Syrian territory. For 3 decades, Iran placed pieces across the board while the international community stayed almost entirely focused on its nuclear program. The proxy network was treated as a secondary problem, an irritant rather than a strategic threat. That assumption aged very poorly. By the time the United States launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, it wasn't facing the Iran of 1988. It was facing the product of 4 decades of deliberate, patient, distributed warfare preparation, and there is an enormous difference between those two things, Operation Epic Fury and the limits of firepower. The opening salvo was staggering by any historical standard. Nearly 900 strikes in 12 hours. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei killed, senior IRGC commanders eliminated, air defense networks across the country targeted, and in many cases, destroyed. Pentagon officials described it as twice the firepower of the 2003 shock and awe campaign that dismantled Saddam Hussein's government in weeks. For a brief moment, it looked like it might actually work. The infrastructure was hit hard, the initial strikes were overwhelming, and the implicit expectation, the one that justified the scale of the operation, was that decapitating the leadership and destroying the air defenses would collapse the Iranian state's ability to resist. It didn't. The government kept functioning. Regional commanders and militia networks that didn't depend on centralized direction kept operating. And most critically, the missile launches kept coming. Iran had designed its military infrastructure with exactly this scenario in mind: distributed command, redundant systems, hardened and hidden launch platforms that didn't require coordination from Tehran to activate. The United States had just run the largest air campaign since 2003, struck over 11,000 targets, and killed the country's supreme leader. And 30 days later, Iran was still fighting. That gap between expectation and reality is where this war lives. The drone economy that's draining America. This is the part that most coverage glosses over, and it's arguably the most important thing happening in this war right now. It comes down to a cost exchange that is almost embarrassing in how one-sided it is. An Iranian Shahed 136 drone costs between $20,000 and $50,000. It is a motorized glider essentially packed with explosives assembled from commercially available components designed to be produced in volume and launched in waves. It does not need to be precise, it does not need to be sophisticated, it just needs to exist in large enough numbers to force a response. The Patriot PAC-3 interceptor that the United States and its Gulf allies use to shoot these things down costs approximately $4 million per shot. The THAAD interceptor, which handles threats at higher altitude, runs between $12 million and $15 million each. That means every time a $30,000 drone forces a $4 million interceptor launch, Iran wins that exchange by a factor of more than 100 to 1. Iran has launched more than 2,000 of these drones into the region since February 28th. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated that coalition forces burned through 1.7 billion in interceptors in just the first 100 hours of the conflict. Across the first 16 days, the combined interceptor bill for the United States, Israel, and the Gulf states reached approximately $26 billion. And here's the detail that is genuinely alarming to every defense planner who's looked at it honestly. Lockheed Martin manufactures roughly 600 Patriot interceptors per year. That production rate cannot be scaled quickly. The supply chain relies on single-source suppliers with lead times measured in months, not weeks. And before Operation Epic Fury even launched, Patriot stockpiles had already dropped to 25% of the level the Pentagon considered adequate. Drained first by a 12-day conflict in June 2025, then further depleted by the extended Houthi campaign in the Red Sea. America is intercepting drones faster than it can manufacture the interceptors to shoot them down. That is not a temporary problem, that is a structural one, and it does not resolve itself quickly. The phantom blockade nobody saw coming. Most analysis of this war focuses on the air campaign over Iran. Thousands of sorties, 11,000 targets struck. The overwhelming application of American air power against Iranian territory. In reality, the decisive front of this war, the one that's doing the most damage, isn't over Iran at all. It's a 21-mile wide strip of water between Iran and Oman called the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran locked it down without firing a single anti-ship missile. What Iran did was deceptively simple. A targeted series of drone strikes on merchant vessels near the strait was enough to trigger a cascade through the global insurance market. By March 5th, every major marine insurer had pulled war risk coverage for vessels attempting to transit the Gulf. And without coverage, no commercial shipping moves. It's that binary. No captain and no shipping company on Earth is going to send a vessel through a war zone without insurance. The liability exposure is simply too catastrophic. Tanker traffic through Hormuz collapsed by 70% almost immediately. Then it fell to functionally zero. Over 150 ships dropped anchor outside the strait and refused to move. The IRGC formally announced the closure on March 2nd and declared any vessel entering the waterway would be treated as a target. Analysts started calling it a phantom blockade, a situation where the financial infrastructure locks down a critical waterway before any physical barrier is even necessary. $7 billion in emergency credit had to be assembled by commodity traders just to avoid forced liquidations. European banks stopped issuing letters of credit for any cargo that depended on Hormuz transit. This wasn't a disruption, it was a shutdown. The numbers behind what flows through that strait are almost hard to believe. 20 million barrels of oil per day. That's 20% of the world's daily supply. Approximately 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade. More than $500 billion in energy commerce annually. When Iran effectively closed that corridor, Brent crude surged from roughly $70 per barrel before the war started to above $170, a gain of more than 50% in 30 days. The International Energy Agency called it the largest disruption to energy supply in the recorded history of the global oil market. The IEA's 32 member nations voted unanimously to release 400 million barrels from emergency reserves. It barely slowed the price climb. Fatih Birol, the IEA's executive director, said publicly that the single most important step for market stability is the resumption of transit through Hormuz. And there is no sign of that happening anytime soon. 3 axes, 1 strategy. What Iran is running right now is not a series of improvised responses. It's a coordinated pressure campaign operating on 3 simultaneous axes, each one designed to exploit a different vulnerability. The first axis is military attrition. Drone and missile waves keep the coalition's interceptor reserves in continuous decline. Every launch forces a response. Every response costs more than the thing being responded to. The math doesn't improve over time. It gets worse as stockpiles shrink and the production pipeline struggles to keep up. The second axis targets the coalition's political foundation. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman, all of them host American forces, and all of them have absorbed Iranian strikes. The UAE Ministry of Defense reported 941 Iranian drones detected since the conflict began. 65 of those penetrated active defenses and struck ports, airports, hotels, and data centers. Emirates Global Aluminium confirmed a direct hit that wounded workers and damaged production capacity. An Iranian missile attack on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia wounded multiple American service members operating from the facility. These are not accidents. They're not overshoot patterns or targeting errors. They are designed to make hosting American forces look like an existential liability to every Gulf monarch who has to answer to his population. If the political cost of supporting the United States becomes too high for Gulf partners, the basing structure that makes the entire air campaign possible starts to fracture. The third axis is economic, and it works through Hormuz. Oil above $170, fertilizer prices up 50%, global growth forecasts cut, inflation projections raised. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency, the first country in the world to do so. Australia made public transport free in 2 states just to offset the fuel price impact on residents. The OECD slashed its global growth forecast from 3.3% to 2.9% and raised G20 inflation projections to 4%. U.S. stock markets have fallen roughly 10% from pre-war highs. And here's the detail that connects this directly to food supply. The Gulf region produces close to half the world's urea and roughly 30% of global ammonia output. 1/3 of the planet's fertilizer supply transits the Strait of Hormuz. With prices up 50% and the channel closed, the mid-April deadline for Northern Hemisphere planting means any sustained disruption in March translates into reduced crop yields by September. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizers sustain approximately 48% of global food production. This war isn't just repricing oil. It's threatening the food supply for a significant portion of the human population. Iran does not need to win any individual engagement to make this strategy work. It needs to keep all 3 axes active simultaneously until the accumulated cost, military, political, and economic, becomes politically unsurvivable in Washington. The card Iran hasn't played yet. We've covered missiles, drones, oil, fertilizer, and insurance markets. But there is one pressure point that Iran has flagged publicly, that it has the means to hit, and that it has deliberately held in reserve. And when you understand what it is, the previous 30 days start to look like a warm-up. The Gulf states are not just petrostates. They are saltwater kingdoms, societies that literally survive by converting seawater into drinking water at industrial scale. More than 90% of Kuwait's and Bahrain's portable water comes from desalination plants, roughly 86% of Oman's, 80% of Israel's, about 70% of Saudi Arabia's. Across the Gulf region, more than 400 desalination facilities supply drinking water to approximately 100 million people. More than 90% of that output comes from just 56 megaplants, large industrial facilities clustered along coastlines that are within easy drone and missile range of Iran. Attacks on this infrastructure have already begun in limited form. On March 7th and 8th, a desalination plant on Iran's Karg Island area was struck, cutting water supply to 30 villages. Bahrain reported an Iranian drone hit on one of its facilities. Kuwait and the UAE have both logged indirect damage near desalination sites. The Iranian parliament issued an explicit public warning. If Iran's power infrastructure is targeted, Iran would pursue what they called the irreversible destruction of the Gulf's desalination and energy facilities. That word, irreversible, matters. They're not threatening disruption. They're threatening permanent damage to infrastructure that takes years to rebuild. Here's the asymmetry that makes this so dangerous. Iran itself gets its water from rivers, dams, and groundwater systems. It is far less dependent on coastal desalination than any of its neighbors. That difference in vulnerability is the leverage. If Iran escalates to full-scale desalination attacks, it's threatening to make parts of the Arabian Peninsula uninhabitable, and it absorbs almost none of the reciprocal risk. No American aircraft carrier can fix a desalination plant. No Tomahawk missile can restore water to a city of 3 million people in a desert. This is the category of escalation that has no military answer. The bill, the polls, and the second front 30 days in. The ledger on America's side of this war is ugly, and it's getting uglier. 13 service members killed, more than 300 wounded. 6 soldiers died in a single attack on a forward position in Kuwait. More than a dozen MQ-9 Reaper drones destroyed or damaged. 3 F-15E Strike Eagles lost in a friendly fire incident, a damaged F-35A that made an emergency landing after a combat sortie, a fatal KC-135 tanker crash in Iraq, 5 more KC-135s damaged by Iranian missiles at an airfield in Saudi Arabia. The first 6 days alone cost $11.3 billion. The 30-day total has passed $18 billion. The request to Congress is $200 billion, and the American public is not on board. The latest Reuters Josh Ipsos polling shows 35% approval for the U.S. strikes on Iran and 61% disapproval. That's not a narrow gap. That's a coalition that doesn't exist domestically, in a war that has no international coalition either. Not a single country on earth has joined the United States in a combat role. The stated mission was regime change. The regime survived. The stated mission was to neutralize Iranian military power. Iran is firing more ordnance into the region in week 4 than it was in week 1, and on March 28th, the war expanded again. Yemen's Houthis fired ballistic missiles at Israel for the first time since Operation Epic Fury began. Air raid sirens went off in Beersheba. The missiles were intercepted, but the Houthis announced they would continue striking until, in their words, the aggression on all resistance fronts stops. They are not making a limited tactical point, they are reopening a front. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea is 16 miles wide. About 12% of global trade passes through it. Saudi Arabia had been rerouting millions of barrels of crude through Red Sea ports precisely because Hormuz was closed. If the Houthis now shut down Bab el-Mandeb as aggressively as they did during the Gaza conflict, when they attacked over 100 merchant vessels and forced Suez Canal traffic down by 70%, both of the major Middle Eastern energy corridors go dark simultaneously. Last year, the United States spent $1 billion bombing Houthi positions in Yemen. After the bombing stopped, the Houthis sank 2 more ships. 2,500 Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit arrived in the region on March 28th. Elements of the 82nd Airborne have also deployed. Military analysts warned immediately that these forces can establish forward positions but cannot sustain themselves in contested territory with supply lines running through 2 potentially closed straits. The historical comparison being drawn in defense circles is Operation Market Garden at Arnhem in 1944, one of the most catastrophic airborne overextensions in the history of modern warfare. A doctrine built on not losing here is what 30 days has revealed. The United States launched the largest air campaign since 2003. It killed Iran's supreme leader. It struck over 11,000 targets. It deployed more firepower in a single operation than most countries will use in a decade. And it did not win. Iran's supreme leader is dead. Its air defenses are degraded. Thousands of targets have been struck. And Iran is still launching missiles daily, still controlling Hormuz, still draining interceptor stockpiles with drones that cost less than a mid-range SUV, still threatening the drinking water of 100 million people, and still keeping the Houthis in reserve as a pressure multiplier. The regime survived, the proxy network survived, the leverage survived, the doctrine survived. And that doctrine, built on the wreckage of the Iran-Iraq War more than 3 decades ago, was never about winning. It was designed around a single strategic principle that Iran has never deviated from. You do not have to defeat the most powerful military in the world. You just have to make the cost of fighting you greater than any realistic benefit. You spread the pain wide enough, hold long enough, and make the war expensive enough that the political will to continue it collapses on the other side before your ability to absorb punishment does. Iran is not trying to conquer territory. It is not trying to destroy the U.S. military. It is trying to outlast an adversary that went into this war with no coalition, no clear exit, no defined victory condition, and no plan for what comes after regime change that doesn't materialize. It is bleeding America in dollars, in interceptors, in political capital, in global standing, one drone at a time. 30 days in, the fundamental question is no longer whether Iran can survive this war. It has absorbed bombardment that no country in modern history has taken at this scale and kept fighting. The question is whether the United States can continue to prosecute a conflict that costs $18 billion a month, polls at 35% approval, has no allied support, and faces an adversary whose entire strategic existence was built around one goal. Don't win, just don't lose, and wait. The war is not over. The desalination card hasn't been played. Bab el-Mandeb may not stay open. The fertilizer shortage will hit food prices by late summer. The interceptor stockpiles will keep declining, and the bill will keep climbing. Whatever comes next, one thing is already clear. The assumption that overwhelming firepower guarantees a decisive outcome didn't survive contact with an enemy that spent 40 years preparing specifically for the day American missiles started falling. That lesson once learned cannot be unlearned.